Hey folks, I'm talking today about Parivartana Yoga, the exchange between planets. And I'm particularly going to talk about the exchange between Mercury and Venus. They actually um, exchange a lot as it relates to, relative to other planets. And I say this because, uh, they're never too far away from each other in the sky. And Mercury and Venus rule two signs that are right next to each other. So often, and they're not too far from the sun at the same time. So you'll see this quite a bit, where Mercury and Venus are often in a conjunction with the sun, or not too far away from the sun, and consequently each other. So it's quite common that when they go through the signs of Taurus and Gemini up here, and when they go through the signs of Virgo and Libra down here, that they're often in an exchange with each other. And so I'm going to explain what that means, and also why it winds up being one of those indicators that that tends to rescue Venus when Venus is in its debilitated state, which it is in Virgo. I talked a little bit about that the last time, about how when I see Venus is debilitated, it doesn't bother me as much as it does with other planets that are debilitated. One of them is because when Venus is debilitated in Virgo, it tends to make us more realistic about our desires and things like that, which is in some ways really quite beneficial because we're unrealistic about our desires often. So when it's in Virgo, we can be more realistic. We might not enjoy all of that stuff as much. That's the difficulty, is we don't get so elated about all the worldly happiness. So we might tend to feel a little disappointed in people or in things that we thought would make us happy. But there's a couple really strong mitigating factors. Number one, again, when Venus is often in its debilitated sign, like we see it now as I record this on October 25th, most of the time, or much of the time, even when Venus is in Virgo, it's often either exchanging with Mercury, the ruler, like it is now the entire time. It's either in an exchange, which is very beneficial, or Mercury has even joined Venus, which is another what's called Nicha Bhanga factor, which modifies the debilitation to the point to where it's not as damaging to our life. It helps to keep together those qualities of our life that would tend to fall apart, particularly with Venus as a house ruler, because everything comes back to the rulerships ultimately for each ascendant. So when any planet is debilitated, which is called Nicha, but it's joined its ruler or it's exchanging with its ruler, that modification tends to be a very strong support, so that even though the thing is weak, it's not totally destroyed or it doesn't bring great suffering. And you can see how it's supported based on whatever the Nicha Bhanga factor is. So it's kind of like if you get sick, like you could look at the planet being in a debility as maybe being sick or having like a weakness, or, we all have a weakness in our body. We have a certain kind of weakness, right? But you'll find that there's not just a weakness, but there's a lot of support that's helping it when there's debilitation, when there's Nicha Bhanga. And the more Nicha Bhanga assistance, the more assistance to the thing that is weak. So again, Venus in itself, or any planet that's in its debilitated sign, in and of itself, it's just one thing. And this is something that, frankly, amateur astrologers or beginning students, frankly, just screw up terribly most of the time. They're like, oh, it's debilitated, debilitated. And they never look at Nicha Bhanga factors. Even if there aren't any strong ones, usually there's some Nicha Bhanga factors, if not explicit like exchanging or joining, there's something that modifies it. but often, I mean, even if there's not, it just means that there's like a weakness in that area where, as I said, perhaps we don't enjoy that thing as much, we don't put as much attention on it, there's some kind of neglect as a result of not enjoying it or something, is what the debilitation shows. And it's only one thing. But then when you get Nichabanga factors, then you're seeing the things that contribute to actually making it strong. You can even have what's called a Nichabanga Raja Yoga, which means that that thing that's debilitated now becomes a great strength because of what's called Raja Yogas that support the thing that looked weak. So this is an example of where something that is weak, let's say like a health issue, winds up being a catalyst for something that makes us a great healer and leads to great longevity. And again, that doesn't mean every Nichabanga Raja Yoga does that or whatever. I'm just giving examples of things, okay? So one of the most powerful modifications of any, whether it's debilitation or just any association between planets, is the Parivartana Yoga, the exchange, when planets exchange. And again, I'm using this current chart as an example because we're, because we're in that time right now where Mercury and Venus are exchanging in the sky right now. By the way, I did want to say, you might see scrolling on the screen below this thing about 4.5 hours worth of classes. You can get 4.5 hours worth of classes if you haven't gotten this before. This is a great offer that I give, hours of professional training videos for free. Again, this is all free. You can just go to VedicAstrologyCertification.com and get that. If you click there, you go to this website. Then you just give, I have a test name here. You just give your first name and then email address here and click sign up now. And you get the first video, which is called History of Vedic Astrology. And I go through the timeline of life on Earth, the history of Vedic astrology, and literally like the timeline of human beings here on Earth. And there's also a really powerful mind map that you can see here. I go over all of these different facets, and then I go over all the facets of that mind map where you can download this manual and whatnot in all of these different videos. It's actually a setup of it's like 7 or 8 videos. The first one is the axis mind map and how we learn. Then the video 2, sacred astronomy, ancient texts, and more. Then the third video, principle stacking and frameworks. Then the fourth video is all about principles, methods, and outcomes. It's a very orderly, structured way of how to do astrology at a high level. If you're confused, this really takes you through it. Priority and sequence, the royal path. All things aren't equal. And again, so this thing that I'm talking about here today is part of that whole kind of matrix of learning. If you're interested, it's all free, and you can go and get that and really understand how astrology works. Not just so you can become an astrologer, which you could do that as well, but so that you can understand life and how things are unfolding according to cosmic will. And that's why I explain things the way I do. Take something that's often confusing, like a Parivartana Yoga, or some bewildering concept like Nichabanga or debilitation, and then the cancellation or modification, and explain it in a way that is sensible. It's not just some complicated idea that bears no resemblance to life on Earth. Astrology literally shows life on Earth and the stories that you're living. Like I said, debilitation can just be something that's weak. But many times something that's weak turns out to be something that's strong. Right? So again, this is what something like a Nichabanga shows. A good example of, maybe one of the most powerful Nichabanga Raja Yogas was Einstein. Albert Einstein had debilitated Mercury, which was his ruling planet. His ruling planet was Gemini. Or, I'm sorry, his ascendant was Gemini. His ruling planet is Mercury, and it's debilitated. Mercury, the sign of intelligence, is debilitated for Einstein, maybe the greatest genius we've ever known. But it had a couple very powerful Nichabanga factors that modified that. It was joined an exalted planet. It also formed a Raja Yoga with that. It also formed a Raja Yoga with another planet. So this thing that was maybe inherently weak, like his own identity, what Mercury rules for a Gemini person, even things like keeping every detail straight, staying focused and concentrated on every detail, became exalted to the highest. And he became this amazing creative thinker because it was joined an exalted Venus, for example. So trying to bring these things out in a way that's relatable, this is the way I teach. And so a lot of people have really learned astrology because I take it out of that complicated, abstract world and make it something real, because that's what it is. It's something that's real. And by the way, that's why I also talk about things like politics and the world situation that we see, even though some people don't like it, because I have to be honest about things that some people don't like. I do it because it shows it, as an alive force. It's not just some bewildering, God, I don't know, something up there. So anyway, today as we're talking about Parivartana Yoga, what the exchange means, it's kind of like, and you can see it literally in this case, because Venus is ruled by Virgo, which is where Venus is right now, is ruled by Mercury, and Libra is ruled by Venus. So we have Venus in the house or the sign ruled by Mercury, and Mercury in the sign or the house ruled by Venus. Literally, if you think about it like it's a house where someone lives. It's like during this time, Venus is in Mercury's house and Mercury is in Venus's house. So imagine if you decided to live with your friend, and you and your friend decided to, exchange houses for a while. You decided to go live in your friend's house, and you let your friend live in your house. Well, that would be, that would be pretty good because, first of all, you're friends. And because you're friendly with each other, your friend living in your house and you living in your friend's house, that's not going to be too bad. It's not going to mess things up too much. Even if your friend doesn't like your house so much, let's say, which Venus doesn't really like being in Virgo. It doesn't like that environment too much. Because it's ruled by a friend, the friend will be there to assist and to help and to maybe arrange it in a way that you like first. Meanwhile, your friend is living in your house, so you'll try to make sure that your house is also comfortable for your friend because you like each other as well. This is the exchange that we get with Mercury and Venus because these two planets are friendly, which means they share most of the things in common. When you get exchanges, when planets exchange, when one planet is in another planet's sign, what they wind up doing is, again, like I just explained, if someone's living in your house and you're living in their house, then you have to work with them. You sort of have the other person in a vulnerable position. Again, if someone is living in your house and you're living in their house, it's kind of like you're sort of equal, but you're in the other person's sort of vulnerable spot. And I use this as an example because you also get exchanges where planets aren't so friendly. Let's say when Venus is exchanging with the Sun, which also happens quite a bit when Venus can be debilitated. Sometimes, or I'm sorry, not when Venus is debilitated, but in fact it happened when the Sun was in, sometimes it actually doesn't happen as often where the Sun is in Libra and Venus is in Leo. But that also happens. But let's say that Venus is exchanging with Jupiter, for example. Venus and Jupiter are not as friendly. They don't share that much in common. So if Venus and Jupiter exchange, They already don't share very much in common. Even the house that they live in is not very much the same. So, for example, Venus lives in a place where there's beauty, sensuality, comfort, a big TV, and very comfortable and worldly. This is Venus kind of energy. Jupiter is like the priest. Jupiter lives like in a church. So again, think about these things sensibly rather than as if it bears no resemblance to life on Earth. Jupiter is like the priest, the guide. He doesn't live in a comfortable house with a bunch of sensual things, with a family running around where he can enjoy a bunch of people. The priest doesn't live there. He lives in a church, or like a monastery even, perhaps. Although that's more Mars, but the priest might be a renunciate or something, but that's where Jupiter is the most comfortable. Meaning, for those things that Jupiter wants to do, being in the place where Venus is prominent is not comfortable. It distracts the Jupiterian nature. It brings Jupiter out of that high, virtuous path into something very worldly, very sensual, maybe sexual, maybe just distracted from Jupiter and that sattvic principle. Consequently, if Venus is in Jupiter's sign or house, and again, it's very literal. It would be like, let's say, Jupiter in Libra, which is all about, again, dating and fun and stimulation and sex and all that, and Venus is in, let's say, Sagittarius, which is literally like a church. Now you're taking, let's say, the pretty girl who wants to get out and date and have fun, and you're putting her in church. It's just not comfortable. That's not where she wants to be. Now you have another kind of exchange where things are uncomfortable. So I want you to think of those parameters there. Think of all that range of possibility when planets exchange with each other. You have a whole variety of possibilities. And what happens with the exchange is, again, but if they've exchanged and Venus has agreed to live in the church and Jupiter has agreed to live in, for example, Libra is like the marketplace and the bazaar and the place where you're selling things and you're trying to get along with everybody like at a store. If Jupiter has agreed to live there and Venus has agreed to live in the church, let's say in this lifetime, then they have to do bazaar. So they have to find some kind of common ground. And along those things that they agree on, those things will be strengthened. Those things will be really fortified when you get exchanges. The things that the planets agree on, and there's always something that the planets agree on. Always. And those things that they agree on will be fortified and strengthened. And those things they disagree on will become points of contention and conflict. And when there's the exchange, it's like an ongoing dialogue that in many ways doesn't really resolve. It's like this circular motion that always happens. It's like this unresolved issue where you'll see literally if it's in someone's birth chart, when you have exchanges, it's like this open loop that's always open in the person. It never seems to resolve. There's something that's always going on with that. Even if it's powerful, even if it's like, for example, with Mercury, Venus, the reason it's a good exchange with Mercury and Venus is because, as I said at the beginning, they agree on a lot, almost everything. They don't really disagree about much. So it's a very cooperative exchange and very powerful when someone has an exchange between Mercury and Venus. And again, this is why often Venus being debilitated is still one of the most blessed, because most of the time Mercury is either also joined there, is often joined, or exchanging. So again, many times, Mercury is also in Virgo with Venus, which is a strong Nichabanga, or it's in Libra where it's exchanging, almost all the time. And so that really supports the debilitation like we're seeing now. And so you also have to bring in the signs where it's happening and whatnot, because that's where you see the field of the exchange. Again, this is Mercury in Libra exchanging with Venus in Virgo, so you bring that into it as well. Like I already explained, Venus in Virgo is quite detailed. It can be worried, sort of unhappy with all of the work and the service and how vigilant they are to all the mistakes and details. And this can make the Venus part of us who wants to just get along be kind of unfulfilled. We don't feel like trying often. When Venus is in Virgo, that feeling is like, ugh, I don't feel like trying. It's almost like we just don't feel like trying. Like, I give up. I already know once I get involved with someone, it's going to be all this work. I got to hear all this stuff I don't agree with. It's just, I don't like doing that. Well, if Mercury is in Libra, then again, Mercury is also very much about communication. It's very much about, it's also a Rajasic planet. Again, the Guna is lined up. These are very important qualities of the planets. Mercury is also about engaging with people, wanting to try to communicate, wanting and taking those details and wanting to connect them with another person, which is Libra. So again, when you see this in a natal chart where Venus is in Virgo and Mercury is in Libra, it's this process happens. Because you always have to look at the ruler of any planet in any situation. The ruler is always very important in how that planet in the sign is going to express itself, not just with Venus in Virgo, or in any situation like the chart we have here. We have a lot of planets in their own signs here, but for example, you would look at Mars in Pisces. A lot, and you look at the nature of Mars, its relationship to the ruler, and whatnot to see its dignity. But then you have to see how powerful is its ruler as to showing what's really coming through. So again, these things are very important when you're looking at exchanges and Parivartana yoga. Hang on a second. And so, one thing just to say, and as I talked about before, again, I'm going to just put this link here again, where people can get these classes. One of the main things that I teach here, when I really start getting into this video here, video 3, principle stacking and frameworks, one of the main things that you see, it says planet signs, houses, and nakshatras, principle stacking. The first things that you start analyzing are the gunas. And the gunas are the motivations. The tamasic guna for protection, individuality, and individual strength, survival. Rajas is about connecting with other people. And sattvic is about connecting with the larger universe through teachings and whatnot. So one of the reasons why, for example, Venus and Mercury get along really well is they're both Rajasic. They're both really focused on connecting with people, connecting with the world, putting that effort in where it feels good to do that. So if Venus is weak like that and Mercury is supporting it, then it's going to make it so that even though the Venus part might not enjoy that compromise, Mercury is going to pull it along and say, and bring more joy to it, but it's going to be like a dialogue, like an open loop, as I said before. It's going to be something that often doesn't resolve. It's like always going on. When you get an example, like I said, with Venus and Jupiter, one of the first things that you notice that's disconnected is the guna. Venus is that Rajasic planet that wants to get along, wants to enjoy life. Rajas is about enjoyment, desire, passion, self-expression with other people. Again, very worldly. Like I said, Libra is really kind of like a sort of like a shopping bazaar, right? That's literally, it's like a man holding a scale in a shopping, like if you go into a shopping bazaar, that's the way they used to have them. But it's kind of like you go to a store or something like that. And again, and that's very Rajasic. It's very worldly. It's a merchant sign, a merchant Rashi, what's called a Vaishya. And again, the merchants are air signs, because good merchants are ones who are good at striking a bargain, striking a deal. That they like doing that. They like engaging with people and giving them a fair deal, kind of like even what I'm doing right here. Like I'm saying, hey, go to this link and get some free classes. I have a lot of planets in air signs, which is very much like Vaishya. Hey, go and do that, and then if you like it, then you can buy some classes too, but just enjoy it. That's the kind of thing that's very Rajasic, right? Whereas Jupiter, let's say that it was in Sagittarius, that Guna is Sattvic, which means it's not about worldly stuff and connecting with people in the world and bargains. And again, bargaining isn't just business, it's relationships as well. I say all the time, relationships are really they're really kind of like business agreements. They're agreements. If someone is good at business agreements, they're often good at relationship agreements. At least they have the potential to be, or one or the other. If you know how to deal with people, you can kind of deal with them regardless. One of the best business skills is to have good people skills. So again, that's the Vaishya, the air quality, the Rajasic quality. Jupiter, Sagittarius, it's the Sattvic quality. It's not about all this stuff of the earth. It's about beliefs, principles, ideals, things that take us beyond that. And you can see the difference here, because that pulls Jupiter out of that area where he wants to be in and puts Venus in that area where she's trying to strike a bargain or get along and interact with people and enjoy herself with that. But you're in church. Church is like, okay, sit there, be quiet, listen to someone preach to you about God and generate this kind of inspiration. Again, it's just uncomfortable. So you can see why, based on even just these fundamental frameworks, why this exchange, let's say between Jupiter and Venus, would be difficult. I'll put the link there again. The link does work. I see people asking, Sam, can you talk about this? Sam, can you talk about that? I'm not going to talk about other things. I'm just going to do this. I'm not going to touch on a bunch of other subjects, okay? It's a lot to just do what I'm doing. So, again, if you want to learn these things, it's just, someone said, talk about the exchange between this and that and this and that. It's the same principles. And you see, one of the reasons why I teach things like principles, if I teach you the principles, then you can do it. You see, one of the reasons why people have such a hard time learning astrology is they don't learn the principles. So people often want astrologers, or I'll just say ask me, like, do a reading, talk about this specific thing in my chart. And rather than actually learn how it works and learn the principles so that you can do it, I'm more interested in you doing it, not me doing it for you. Not me talking about the thing in your chart or whatnot. This is why when I teach principles, that's why. Because if you understand the principle, then you can understand it yourself rather than just having me tell you. Because if I'm telling it to you, you might say, oh, that's right, that's correct. But it's still something outside of you telling you something. I would rather you know it for yourself. If you know it for yourself, then you know it. And it's not just that you believe it. I want you to understand the difference here. Because me telling you something might be something where you say, oh, that's right, I believe that's why. But that's belief. If you know it, and you learn the principle, and you learn why and how it works, then it's not just something that you have to believe in. where some astrologer tells you something and you believe it, but you don't know it. You see? Knowledge and belief are different things. I want people to know it. That's why I teach it, not just believe it or believe in it. Because again, anytime we're just believing in something, even if it's something that's true or correct, if you're just believing in it, then you don't know it. I want you to ponder the difference. What is the difference between believing in something, like believing in some astrology thing that you think you know, and something that you actually know? For example, you know where you're sitting and the clothes you're wearing and the house you live in. This is stuff that you know. If someone tried to confuse you about that, their confusion would have no effect on you. It would be like if someone tried to call you, an ostrich. Oh, you're just an ostrich. And they started talking about how you were an ostrich. You would just think, you're crazy, because I know I'm not an ostrich. But if someone said something like, oh, you're just a pathological narcissist because you did this and you did this and you did this, and you're a sociopath and you're this and that, you'd be like, am I? Is that true? Because you don't know that. Now, I'm just using this as an example, but someone says something that you don't know if it's right or wrong, then you have to believe something about it. Either believe it's right or believe it's wrong, and it sits very different. The same thing as if I said, well, the reason this is this way in you is because of this astrology thing or that astrology thing. It might be totally correct, and then you believe that the reason you're that way is because of what I said, and it's something that you believe. But what if you knew it? What if it was knowledge? And again, most people don't even think that this kind of astrological knowledge is possible. They don't even think you can have knowledge of astrology. They think it's all some kind of belief sort of thing going on somewhere. They think everything is some kind of belief, some kind of version of that, and it's not. It has to become knowledge. And so I teach these things as facets and aspects so that you know them, so that it's knowledge, not just belief. With myself and my students, when they look at charts, they know what they're looking at. It's knowledge. It's not like, well, I wonder if this is true. No, it's like, this is the way it is, that's the way this is, that's the way this is. Just as real and just as something that you can know, just as certain as anything else that you can know. And so with exchanges and whatnot, it's the same kind of thing. And exchange, again, it's a very powerful structure. And again, I talk about it in a lot of my courses, but the thing to really understand about exchanges, and again, you have to see them in a very nuanced way, but it really just boils down to a couple of things. One is that it's based on the nature of the planets and their relationships with each other. The things they share that they have in common will get strengthened. And because Mercury and Venus share a lot in common, that exchange between Mercury and Venus, or even a conjunction or whatnot, like I use the example of Einstein, who has a debilitated Mercury, but it's joined exalted Venus, because they share so much in common, it's a very powerful Nichabanga. But the things that they don't will become points of disagreement. So with Mercury and Venus, some of the points of disagreement are, that Mercury is much more sort of hyper-literal, much more detail-oriented, and again, much more, I would say, much less forgiving. Mercury is very blunt. Mercury, again, you can just tick down the details. Mercury and Venus are both Rajasic. They're both related to earth and air, right? So they have a lot of that in common. But, for example, Mercury is a neutral planet. Venus is a feminine planet. Okay, that's very different. Very different motivation. So that attribute will be a point of contention. For example, again, Mercury is very blunt. Mercury doesn't care whose feelings get hurt when he speaks the truth. Mercury's got to say the truth. He's got to say it. That's it. Sorry, I got to say it. That Venus part of us is like, but I don't want to say it if it's going to make somebody upset. I don't want to upset anybody. So this will be a point of contention between Mercury and Venus with the exchange and just in general. And by the way, these are points of contention in life in general. The bluntness of Mercury, the candor of Mercury, is often at odds with the other parts of our nature. So this is why that Mercury part of everyone needs to learn how to be diplomatic. And again, this is the strength. So the bluntness of Mercury gets mixed with the diplomacy of Venus, and ultimately, these are very harmonious. But when there's an exchange or something like this, that's going to be a point of dissension, where Mercury is always feeling like, well, I got to be diplomatic now, or I'm not sure. Okay, now I have to be candid and blunt, and Venus doesn't like it. The Venus part of us goes, oh, I wish I would have been blah, blah. I go through it all the time, by the way, because I have a strong Mercury, and I have to say what I have to say what I see is true. I have to. And then I also have Venus has actually joined it, and it's very close, and it's like, I wish I could do it without people getting upset, because I really don't like upsetting people, but I can't help it. I don't care that much. No, I do. I really don't like people getting upset by what I say. But I'm not going to not say what I see as being true. And, you know, that's just the way it is, you know. And again, you see this as priorities. Because, for example, I'm not a Libra or a Taurus. I'm a Gemini. And because my nature is to be an embodiment of that part of it. It's that quality that's most prominent. And if I don't do that, it's like I can't live with myself if I don't say the part that I think is true, even if people don't like it. But the Venus part of me doesn't, it tries to be diplomatic and tries to be, and is genuinely respectful of other people's views. And again, this is the thing that Mercury and Venus wind up sharing, is that, and this is one of the biggest problems with Mercury and Venus from other people's point of view. Because, for example, if you say a truth that other people don't like, and they don't like you for it, oftentimes people assume you don't like them for it, which is actually not necessarily the case. It's not personal. But it still has to be said, right? And the projection of, oh, you said this, you're mean to this person or that person or whatever it is that people would project doesn't necessarily mean that's true. And again, that's also another thing you just have to live with. Or especially as it relates to things like people's political views or debates or discussions or whatever it might be. People will get angry, really, at the truth teller often, and assume that the truth teller is also angry, or assume that the truth teller also is judging the other people. Again, then these things of judgment and anger, these are other planets. This is Jupiter, Mars. These other things come in. And a Mercury truth teller, so to speak, is not, and again, it doesn't mean it can't be. Some Mercury truth tellers can be really angry about the other people or judgmental or whatnot. But again, that's not necessarily the case. So this is just an example, for example, of how Mercury and Venus, they share this desire to connect with people, ideas, more of a priority on Mercury to be speaking the truth, regardless of how it comes, regardless of how people respond to it, because Mercury is neutral. Neutral means it doesn't have a bias toward being right or wrong, at least in the sense of defending our opinions, which is more the masculine planets, or trying to be diplomatic and get along, which are the feminine planets. Because those feminine planets have this bias, which is Venus and the Moon, toward getting along, even at the expense of speaking the truth. Again, Mercury is neutral. By the way, the masculine planets, which would be the Sun, Jupiter, and Mars, have a bias towards doing what's right. Doing what's right. Doing what's right. That's their bias. If it's right, I need to do what's right, regardless of how it makes me feel or makes others feel. So those two, the masculine and feminine planets, have a very strong bias toward their idea, their goal. Mercury and Saturn don't. Mercury and Saturn are neutral in that within that attribute. Mercury is like, whether it's right or wrong or whatever, this is the fact. It's like it's kind of like a scientific kind of detachment. Like, even if I agreed with it before, now I see there's other evidence has come, and no, that's not true. It's not correct, and it has to be said. Saturn is the same way, but in a different way. Saturn is more that way also, but as it relates to our actions. Saturn is like, okay, I thought this was right for all this time. Now I realize it's not, and I need to commit to do something else. I need to get rid of that thing and commit to something else. And again, these are very important planets in that regard, Mercury and Saturn. So again, this is one of the other attributes where planets, when they exchange, this can be a point of contention. Like I said with Jupiter and Venus, so I talked about Jupiter-Mars, I talked about Mercury-Venus, where they share the guna, they share the elements, mainly of the signs that they rule, but they don't share that motivation of being feminine or neutral. So if we look at Venus and Jupiter, for example, okay, Venus is feminine, Jupiter is masculine. Again, not the same. Venus is Rajasic, again, about desires. Jupiter is Sattvic, about the big picture and, having faith in things. They don't agree. Venus is related to air and earth. Again, Venus rules Libra, an air sign, Taurus, an earth sign. Jupiter rules fire and water. Again, not the same. So you can see why these planets, you get Venus, the planet, in Sagittarius, the fire sign. You get Jupiter, the planet, in Venus, in Libra, let's say, the air sign. They're not even in their element, right? They're not even in their element. Whereas we see here, Mercury and Venus are also literally in their element. Venus is in an earth sign. Well, Venus rules an earth sign, Taurus. Mercury is in an air sign. Well, Mercury rules an air sign. So again, they're even in their element. So again, these things are just very, I explain it like this because too often what happens when we approach something that looks really complicated, it is complex to then interpret it. When you see a chart, now you have to take these things and interpret them, this Parivartana yoga. But the reason that you learn all of these details is because that's what you're interpreting. That's what you're interpreting. So what you do is you explain that to a person. You explain the thing I just said, where it's this constant dialogue. This one is not in its element this way, this one that way. Venus is the part that wants to da-da-da-da-da, but now it's in a very fiery place where it's trying to conjure up all these fiery opinions and ideas, and like in a church preacher, like someone preaching at, it's too preachy. And then Jupiter, who is trying to connect with higher purpose, is now like almost like in a shopping mall trying to get along with customers. That's a kind of example. But then you would kind of explain what that dialogue would be. So what do they share in common? Well, they're both teachers. They're both Brahmins. So what they would share is things like wanting to inspire, because they're both gentle planets. They're both benefic planets, what are called beneficial planets. By the way, so is Mercury and Venus. They're also both benefics. One isn't cruel. But Venus and Jupiter share that goal, so they're both looking to give. and uplift, but in different ways. Venus uplift personally, Jupiter uplift spiritually. Okay, so they share that. So that exchange will support that, but it will often create a disconnect on how to do it. Do I do it this way? And it's going to feel like a very difficult compromise often. Now, again, if you have it in your chart, then you're used to that. But this is the kind of thing that you explain to a person. You know, this is why you have, like if someone had it in their chart, let's say the Jupiter Venus, I would wind up saying that, you know, this is why you have this deep passion to want to elevate humanity, and you care so much like about social issues and wanting to connect, you know, people with a higher purpose. But it tends to be so mixed together. Like you get your spirituality mixed with your politics and your culture, and you never really do either one so well. You're just kind of going back and forth. You get them all confused together. Your spiritual practices are always mixed with a bunch of ideas and politics and some kind of, you know, humanism or something. And your humanism is always mixed with some kind of fiery, you know, inspiration or some kind of fiery rhetoric and belief. Like they're, you see, what happens is they get mixed. They get mixed together. It's always better when things are clean. Like, for example, even though we have this exchange and they wind up working together, it would be much better if Mercury were in Virgo and Venus was in Libra. Because now they're in their own place. They're not getting mixed. Right? You always want to imagine what it would be like if the planet was in its own place. Instead of having Venus in Sagittarius and Jupiter in Libra, you take the ideal. What if it was Venus in Libra and Jupiter in Sagittarius? Now you have Venus in the environment that it wants to be in, making the agreement and feeling good and complete in that exchange. And you have Jupiter in the church doing the preaching, and he's feeling complete in that exchange. Instead, when they're mixing and exchanging, it's like Jupiter in the bazaar, in the shopping center or in the public square wants to be in the church preaching. Instead, he's preaching to the customers or something. It's like, no, he doesn't want to be preaching to the customers. He wants to be preaching to the parishioners, the people in the church. And Venus, instead of taking care of the customers, she's taking care of the people in the church and getting too personally involved with everything and everyone. And all of the statements that come from the church feel like judgments and so judgmental. And oh, that's not very nice and all, because Venus wants everything to be nice. And Jupiter and the church, they're not very nice. They don't care about being nice. They care about telling the truth. And the truth is, do this or you're going to hell, or whatever it might be, which isn't a very nice way to say it. But every spiritual teaching is a bunch of, in many ways, instructions. And they're not nice. Because their point isn't to be nice. And the Jupiter part of us and the Mars part of us and the Sun part of us doesn't care that it's not nice. They just want the truth. Just give me the straight deal. So again, the Jupiter, Mars part of the parts that like that fiery truth, they're fine in Sagittarius. Venus is like, yeah, but that's not very nice. Oh, but you sound so judgmental. Oh, but... and it gets confused. So, and it winds up being an ongoing thing. When it's in someone's natal chart, this exchange winds up being a kind of, like I said before, like an open loop, like a dialogue that doesn't resolve. It's like always going back and forth. But as I said, relative to the things that they agree upon, which again, this can also be things like art, and even things like law and art and uplifting and teaching. It could be very powerful. And you would expect that. And especially the planets that rule them in dasha cycles and all that stuff. Again, all of those principles are in play. All those principles are in play. All the other principles of astrology, again, like the karmas ripen in dasha cycles and all like that, you would see that maybe success happen, but you would absolutely have to know that this dialogue is always going on. Within the person, that's happening. And again, that's what I say about it's 100%. This is why you want to learn these principles yourself, when you learn these principles yourself, I'll put this link again. When you learn these principles yourself, then it's not just someone saying something to you that you believe in. Again, then you know it. Then it becomes knowledge. And so again, you can get some of these free classes. The principle stacking and frameworks. These principles and frameworks are things like elements, gunas, the modalities of the signs, the attributes of the planets. Some are Brahmins, some are merchants, some are, they have neutral, they're benefic, malefic, all these different categories. And then you just put those things together, principles, methods, and outcomes. Again, this is a way that I've also broken up the three kind of ways to do astrology. Principles are the principles like I'm explaining. The gunas, elements, the different qualities. The methods are how you organize those things. Like, for example, the Viparit Raja Yoga is one of the methods. It's a method. It takes a principle, it takes these principles and organizes them a certain way. It's a method. It's not an outcome, it's a method. So the methods are things like Raja Yogas, Viparit Raja Yogas, all of the things, aspects, all of the calculations that you use to organize all of those principles, right? They get organized into methods where it's this aspect. And this is where a lot of students hang out in between. They're not very strong on principles. They don't really understand the principles very well. Most students don't understand principles very well. They focus a lot on methods like, I can identify this thing, that thing. It's a yoga, it's a this, it's a that, it's a conjunction, it's a blah, blah, blah. They learn a couple what are called methods. But then you don't know how to interpret them at all in order to predict a outcome. What does it mean? Because you can identify something, you can identify that it's a yoga, or you can identify this thing. It's kind of irrelevant unless you can interpret it and predict the outcome. Like I'm doing here, I'm talking a lot about the outcome. How would you interpret that thing? So again, you have to take a principle like a guna, element, modality, natural, karaka. That's a principle. You connect it to a method like an exchange. What does the exchange mean? What does that method show you? But then you have to interpret it. Okay, it shows this principle, and that principle is this. This one is that, and then you have to interpret it. So again, if you don't know, if you haven't learned the framework yet, if you haven't learned the principle, you definitely can't predict the outcome. You don't know because you don't know the principle yet. So if you're trying to interpret something like an exchange or something like that, you don't know how to interpret it at all. Maybe you can identify it, but then you're just identifying things. Oh yeah, that's an exchange. What does it mean if it's this or that? Again, unless you learn the principle really well, you can't interpret it. And that's why the outcomes are important. And by the way, doing like I'm doing now is just a very basic level of an outcome. Just interpreting like how it feels with the person is the most basic thing. It's also very important, but the real outcome is when you get a dasha cycle and you get a timing and you get this or that, what happens, right? So then you also have probably the most important afterwards is this priority and sequence. This is how you can do that accurately because everything is not as important as everything else. In making an outcome, right, you have to prioritize things. So that's when it starts to become really predictive because you have to look and see this thing has more importance than this other thing, especially right now because there's a timing and there's all kinds of things. Again, this is where we also do things like resolve contradictions. There's this idea that is just very prevalent. Let me take a quick drink. That there's all this contradictory information in Vedic astrology. Nothing is contradictory. Nothing. Now, you might think that's weird because you hear astrologers all the time say, well, what happens if the Rashi chart says this and the Navamsha chart says that? Then what? Or this says that, but that says that. Then what? Oh, the big good thing, bad thing, good thing, bad thing. Now what? Again, this is just a failure to actually learn the principles well or learn these things well. Nothing contradicts anything else. Everything is different from everything else. Always, from now to the end of time, if you never hear another thing I say, hear this. If you're thinking that one thing is contradicting something else, it's because you don't really understand either one of them very well. And again, this is one of the most important things that you learn when you learn these principles correctly, is what every little thing is. Right? There's no way that the Navamsha chart can contradict the Rashi chart, because they're different things. It's like saying, well, this hand feels good and this one feels bad, so what? Okay, then that's what happens. The Rashi chart is different than the Navamsha chart, or whatever it might be. It's really just when we get confused by the complexity of astrology, we want to grasp for something like that, but it's not true, okay? The reason it appears that way is because we haven't learned those things correctly yet. The Navamsha chart is a quality of the Rashi chart. Everything is. So again, when you understand this, then you don't get confused by things like that, or really anything that looks to be contradictory. You know, for example, even in this chart that we were looking at, again, many times the average student would say, well, it's debilitated, you know, but if someone even knew about the exchange, if they even looked at the Nichabanga, which again, many times students don't, they'll just look at the debilitation. They'll just look at the debilitation and go, oh yeah, it's debilitated. They learn that. Again, they don't even learn about the Nichabanga, which is the exchange with the ruler. But then, well, but what if it's retrograde? Does that make it bad? But it's also aspected by Mars. Does that make it bad? And it's just this combination of good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. And we take these judgments, and instead of thinking critically and what each thing means, it just becomes a judgment. Oh, bad thing debilitated, good thing exchange, bad thing retrograde, bad thing aspect by Mars. You know, bad thing that the sun is debilitated, blah, 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 right? And it can just be good, bad, good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. So now I'm confused because it's good, bad. None of it's confusing. All of it is just an interpretation. Okay? So again, you shouldn't get confused by these things, and if that is the case, it's because you need to learn what those things are better. So again, I hope that this explanation about Parivartana yogas in general was helpful for you, that you enjoyed learning about it. Again, it's these exchanges. When the planets exchange, the things that they agree on get strengthened. If they agree on a lot, like if it's friendly planets exchanging with each other, then it can really bolster, especially a lot of those things that they agree on, which again, with Mercury and Venus, it's a lot. If it's an unfriendly exchange, then they don't agree on very much, but the things they do agree on will still get strengthened, but it's still like an open loop, almost like being in like a revolving door. That's what the Parivartana yoga is like. This issue within the person doesn't resolve, but the areas that the two planets agree on get strengthened and fortified. It pops out, and you really see it in the dasha planets. In the dasha cycles when those planetary rulers run, and it's quite an interesting thing. You should always look at exchanges. It's one of the biggest things. And by the way, especially anytime you're looking at any planet that's debilitated or whatever it is, look for the Nichabanga, look for the exchange or the other factors. Again, I hope you avail yourself of hours of free classes like I posted. It's definitely a good way for you to learn some astrology for free and learn these principles and the history correctly, so that you're not, so confused by simple things that you really should know, not just about astrology, but actually